Hello, welcome to Tech Time Today. I am your host, Jeff Welpley, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about a radically new architecture for micro-frontends called Web Fragments. In case you're unfamiliar with the term micro-frontends, they're a way of breaking down a large user interface into smaller, more manageable, independently deployable pieces. The key radically different thing about Web Fragments is that it focuses on isolating individual micro front ends from each other by executing their client-side JavaScript in a separate JavaScript context, basically in a separate iFrame. So just like Docker enables containerization of applications, Web Fragments enable containerization of web front ends. So what does this look like? I created a demo app that I open sourced. I'll include a link in the description that has Angular as the host application, that is the main user interface, and then a few different fragments. So these would be different pieces, the micro front ends that are managed independently from one another. So in this case, I have them all in the same mono repo, but in theory, each of these 4 pieces could be managed completely separate from one another on separate repos if you wanted. So I have an Angular fragment and a React fragment and a vanilla fragment, and each of these 3 fragments are living inside of the host app, which just happens to be Angular, but you could use whatever you want. So in the Angular fragment, it's really just a basic Angular app, an Angular SSR app that I generated from the command line using the Angular CLI. There are basically just 2 things that you have to do within your Angular app to enable it. One is set a deploy URL. The reason for this is that all of the URLs need to have a full domain name in all the paths, because this fragment is going to be running inside the context of another app. So even though this fragment is running on port 3001, the host app is going to be on a different port 3010, or I think that's what I set it at. In production, it could be different domain names or whatever. And so you have to make sure that all of the links to JavaScript files, to CSS files, all that type of stuff for this fragment include the full domain name. And so that you do that with the deploy URL in your Angular JSON. And then the second thing that's needed is CORS, because you are going to be requesting from the host app, making requests to your fragment app. And so by default, CORS is going to block that. So you just have to enable it. Okay, and when I run the Angular app, so this is not in the context of the host app. So this is just looking at the fragment by itself. So I'm looking on port 3001 just at the Angular fragment in isolation. And then separately, we have another fragment for vanilla JavaScript. So this is literally just one index.html that contains a box that changes colors. This is what the vanilla JavaScript fragment looks like in isolation. And this is the React fragment, where it's just a button that changes some messages on the screen. And this is what the React app looks like. So I click the button, it just changes what the message displayed says. And now let's look at the host app. So the host app, like I mentioned, I did with Angular. You could use whatever you want. And within the one page in the host app, I define in the HTML the 3 different web fragments. And to enable web fragments, you just need the initialized web fragments called in your main.ts. And the final piece is in your server.ts. You need to define the gateway that basically manages requests, so that when requests come to the host app, it can forward it to each fragment. So the Angular fragment, the vanilla JavaScript fragment, and the React fragment. All right, so this is the host app running with the 3 fragments. And you can see that I can click on the counter, change the color, change the messages. So these 3 fragments as you saw, are three completely different pieces of code. Each have can be deployed separately, can be managed completely independently. If we look under the scenes at the actual web fragment element, you'll see that what's happening here and the way in which this library works is that it creates a shadow root under the web fragment element, and where it defines essentially, instead of in the actual fragment app, it's defined like a normal application HTML with the document, the HTML, head, body, etc. So the web fragments library will modify that somewhat, and behind the scenes, if there's JavaScript, CSS, etc. that has to load, it'll basically create a hidden iframe that loads those and allows them to run in this isolated shadow DOM. Now let's talk about broadcasting events, because for various reasons, you may want your fragment to be able to communicate to other fragments or the host application. And what we're using is a web standard. And so we create the new broadcast channel, add a listener for that channel so we can listen to events as well as actually broadcast on them. And then when we added a button here for sending a message. And so when we click on that, it will broadcast the message. And then if one of the other fragments broadcasts a message, we're also listening for it, and then it will handle it. Going back to our user interface, let's click on the buttons, and you'll see that if I click on the Angular broadcast event button, that the other two fragments received it from Angular, and then I could click on the Vanilla.js broadcast button, and the other two fragments received it, and click on the React one, and the other two received it. All right, so who is Web Fragments for? Like, what are the use cases of why you would want to use it? If you wanted to migrate a large monolithic application, if you have a really large team that manages a really complex user interface, each of the different teams that are managing different parts, especially in like a dashboard, that's like a very right in a sweet spot for using something like this. You can have different teams managing the certain charts within the dashboard versus certain administrative pieces. So probably not surprisingly, the primary use cases this was originally built for was for Cloudflare by Igor Minar, who is previously the head of the Angular team. He created this in order to help Cloudflare with their own web dashboard, which they have many, many different, it's a very complex, if any of you guys use Cloudflare, you know that there's a lot of functionality in there, a lot of different pieces that come together that allow users to manage their entire Cloudflare infrastructure. So anything like that, I mean, is this type of framework is amazing for, and gives so much flexibility to the company to be able to expand and change things without fate sharing, which is, I think, the big issue that they wanted to avoid, where you have something that one team that is doing adversely affect another team. And once you kind of separate that out, it gives people the freedom to kind of innovate without that worry. It helps so much in these bigger environments.